Lesson 19. Respond to your critics in writing. Although Stanley ignored a lot of negative critique, merely allowing fans of his work to counter his critics and letting box office figures speak for themselves, there were occasions upon which an influential publication would attack him and which demanded a retort. One thing he didn't generally do was retort over the phone. This denied the attacking editorial control over how it published his responses. When an editor has made its mind up what position it is taking on a given issue, it usually results in an article that is biased, either consciously or unconsciously, by careful selection and deletion of information, and by the order in which the information is given and the precise wording. The headline of an article, the one thing that the editorial knows virtually every reader will actually read, generally implies directly what the writer or editor is trying to persuade the reader to believe. Defensive arguments given by parties a publication is attacking are usually reserved for the very end of the article, which happens to be the text that the fewest people will bother reading. When The Observer in London ran a negative article about Lolita 4 months before its UK release, Stanley wrote a letter to them citing the various favourable reviews and pointing out his arguments against the content of their article. The Observer then agreed to publish Kubrick's letter of objection in defence of his work. He probably requested they do this rather than edit their own version of his arguments. By contrast, when I was negotiating with Mercury Press in Liverpool to secure their publication of corrections regarding a smear attack article they'd written about me, I provided the wording that I wanted their editorial to publish, written from their point of view. With some negotiations over this wording, they eventually agreed to publish a statement that was very close to what I'd requested. It captured all the essential arguments, but fell short of them admitting liability for having deliberately disinformed their readers, though the implication was obvious anyway from the severity of the corrections. In turn, I contacted various online political bloggers who had cited and repeated the false allegations originally posted by Mercury Press and persuaded them to remove their articles as well. It was a powerful public relations victory for me because the whole affair established that my work had become influential enough to incite hateful smear attacks from some very well-funded and politically connected sources. But more importantly, it has established for any future smear attackers that I know how to fight back against them, even if they're a national newspaper. One of the worst published attacks Kubrick's work ever faced was a piece by Fred M. Heschinger in the New York Times, titled "A Liberal Fights Back." As is common with many supposed intellectuals who have few artistic impulses, Heschinger perceived the showing of violence in A Clockwork Orange to be an endorsement of violence. It's a common mistake among the uncreative, who don't get symbols and metaphors in art and are also unable to get subtle jokes, especially satirical ones. Heschinger's article finished with an attempt to brand Kubrick's film pro-fascist, pretty much the default name-calling tactic common to a lot of people who consider themselves liberals or socialists. Quote, "If there is anything to make American liberals cringe here and now, it is the possibility that, in a reversal of history, Europe may this time be more sophisticated than America about the nature of the fascist threat. This is why American liberals have every right to hate the ideology behind A Clockwork Orange and the trend it symbolizes." End quote. And that was Fred M. Heschinger attacking Kubrick in the New York Times. It's certainly arguable that Stanley's views were more liberal than Heschinger's, but anyone can adopt such labels as they please. Kubrick wrote to the editor a very detailed rebuttal of Heschinger's article and asked for it to be printed. The piece completely tore apart Heschinger's accusation and, no doubt, embarrassed the so-called film critic. Quote, "It is baffling that in the course of his lengthy piece encouraging American liberals to cherish their right to hate the ideology behind A Clockwork Orange, Mr. Heschinger quotes not one line, refers to not one scene, analyses not one theme from the film, but simply lumps it indiscriminately in with a trend which he pretends to distinguish, a deeply anti-liberal totalitarian nihilism, in several current films. Is this, I wonder, because he couldn't actually find any internal evidence to support his trend spotting? If not, then it is extraordinary that so serious a charge should be made against it and myself inside so fuzzy and unfocused a piece of alarmist journalism. Heschinger is probably quite sincere in what he feels, but what the witness feels, as the judge said, is not evidence, the more so when the charge is one of purveying the essence of fascism. Is this an uncharitable reading of the film's thesis? Mr. Heschinger asks himself with unwanted if momentary doubt. I would reply that it is an irrelevant reading of the thesis. in fact an insensitive and inverted reading of the thesis, which, so far from advocating that fascism be given a second chance, warns against the new psychedelic fascism, the eye-popping, multimedia, quadrasonic, drug-orientated conditioning of human beings by other human beings, which many believe will usher in the forfeiture of human citizenship and the beginning of zombiedom." End quote. And Kubrick went on by bringing into the equation other film critics, rivals in Heschinger's profession, who were doing a more respectable job, and who had actually praised Clockwork Orange. Rather than praising his own work, Stanley simply quoted praise that had come from other respectable sources, which by comparison made Heschinger's arguments appear reactive, poorly conceived, unprofessional, and unethical. He also cited the praise of respected institutions for A Clockwork Orange when interviewed by Michael Cement. Quote, "No one is corrupted watching A Clockwork Orange any more than they are by watching Richard III. A Clockwork Orange has received worldwide critical acclaim as an important work of art. It was chosen by the New York film critics as the best film of the year, and I received the Best Director award. It won the Italian David Donatello award. The Belgian film critics gave it their award. It won the German Spotlight Award. It received 4 USA Oscar nominations and 7 British Academy Award nominations. It won the Hugo Award for the Best Science Fiction Movie. It was highly praised by Fellini, Buñuel and Kurosawa. It has also received favourable comment from educational, scientific, political, religious and even law enforcement groups. I could go on. But the point I want to make is that the film has been accepted as a work of art, and no work of art has ever done social harm. Though a great deal of social harm has been done by those who have sought to protect society against works of art which they regarded as dangerous." End quote. That was Kubrick talking to Michael Cement. Getting back to the Hechinger exchange, Stanley went on to cite a variety of popular and praised literary works containing arguments that also conflicted articulately with the views of Hechinger. And so he basically places Hechinger in the mould of being an ideological poser who is as conditioned in his views as A Clockwork Orange's lead character. The artistic and ideological blindness of many film critics was summed up by Stanley as follows. Quote, "I find a lot of critics misunderstand my films, probably everybody's films. Very few of them spend enough time thinking about them. They look at the film once, they don't really remember what they saw, and they write the review in an hour. I mean, one spent more time on a book report in school. I'm very pleased with A Clockwork Orange. I think it's the most skillful movie I've made. I can see almost nothing wrong with it." End quote. That was Stanley interviewed by Craig McGregor. Quote, "The intellectual is capable of understanding what is intended and gets a certain amount of pleasure from that, whereas the mass audience may not. But I think that the enemy of the filmmaker is not the intellectual or the member of the mass public, but the kind of middlebrow who has neither the intellectual apparatus to analyse and clearly define what is meant, nor the honest emotional reaction of the mass film audience member. And unfortunately, I think a great many of these people in the middle are occupied in writing about films. I think that it is a monumental presumption on the part of film reviewers to summarise in one terse, witty, clever, Time magazine-style paragraph what the intention of the film is. That kind of review is usually very superficial and extremely unfair, unless it is a truly bad film." End quote. That was Kubrick speaking to Robert Emmett Jena. The kind of response given by Kubrick to Hechinger would be very difficult to do in a telephone conversation or a televised debate. The practice of responding to critics in writing allows you to carefully consider, weigh up, and sequence the evidence in support of your position and refine your choice of words. It's too easy to slip up in live discussion with journalists by forgetting key facts and quotes, and by using poorly chosen words that misrepresent your ideas, or even worse, give the journalist scope to misrepresent your ideas. Ever since the political smear attack launched on me in 2010, the one involving Mercury Press, I've made it my default position that journalists must submit their questions to me by email so that I can give a well-considered written response, usually also by email. In addition, this takes away the opportunity for any ill-meaning journalist to misquote me because the recorded content of the emails can serve as legal evidence against them. Journalists know this, and it's one reason why many of them prefer unrecorded face-to-face or telephone discussions. It gives them plausible deniability later if they are accused of misrepresenting their interviewee. Very few journalists will bother making an attempt to bait an interviewee who demands an interview that is thoroughly recorded. TV interviews are another minefield which Kubrick avoided. Interviewers are generally briefed by their editors to focus on specific issues only and avoid other issues, often ones that are more revealing. They're literally told to attack and embarrass certain guests and praise others. In some instances, biased questions are asked by audience members who have been carefully selected to promote a particular view, or are even moles planted by organisations to sway a televised debate. With a video interview that isn't live, one that is edited and transmitted later, the scope for pigeonholing guests through selective editing is even greater. An interviewee may give remarkably clear and coherent answers, which are then simply edited out. Quote, and the great complaint about him not giving interviews was so easy to explain. Because he was also the producer of his films, he wanted to advertise them as well. He wanted to write the text he wanted, posters and all, and he didn't want to ruin it by giving bad, hasty interviews. Especially chat shows he considered extremely dangerous at selling your product, and so he just didn't give many interviews. And he had a few selected journalists all of the time, but on the whole, not much. End quote. And that was Stanley's wife, Christiane, interviewed by Todd Gilchrist. The majority of political debate today seems to revolve around this artificial discourse that anyone who expresses even the slightest form of offensive statement in conversation must be kept out of office and blacklisted against being heard by anyone. The truth is that everybody regularly says things in casual conversations that can be perceived by others as politically incorrect or offensive. I've met several politicians and can assure you that they are, in fact, human in this respect. The suit-wearing and the edited opinions they offer in public debate are a mask, a false front of socialist sincerity designed to shield them from critical attacks by the media and their political opposition. But behind the scenes they are as full of bigoted opinions toward different sectors of society and self-interested ambitions for money, status and power as anyone else is. And the most dangerous of them are the ones who consciously believe that they are genuine proponents of universal equality. It's a simple fact that the vast majority of politicians are far more concerned about the welfare of themselves and their immediate family, friends and political allies than they are about protecting the rights of some particular sector of society. This is human reality, and until the goalposts of debate are shifted to more honest and productive territory, anyone pursuing goals that are even remotely related to influencing the world beyond their own private lives is best taking the precaution of learning how to deny their opposition a window for attack. And one of the most reliable ways of doing so is to always respond in writing to critics.